really delighted to have Professor Simine Vazire as our speaker today. And she's up bright and early in Melbourne to speak to us on validating research on its own merits. Dr. Vazire is a professor at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences in the Ethics and Wellbeing Hub. One of the things that she does is examine people's self-knowledge of their personality and behavior. She has looked also at individual and institutional practices and norms in science and how these norms encourage and impede self-correction credibility. She's editor-in-chief of Collabora Psychology and a board member of PLOS, the Public Library of Science. She has great interest in reproducibility and transparency and research in general and social sciences in particular, I guess. And as many of you know, we at the University of Michigan have been trying to do an institutional focus on reproducibility in our research. And we have a lot to learn from scholars like Professor Vazire. So I'm really delighted that she's here. Before I turn it over to her, James, if you could move to the next couple of slides. Yes, I want to just tell you about a couple of the speakers coming up. Next week is Heng Ji from the University of Illinois. On the 15th is Patricia Murrieta Flores from Lancaster. And March 22nd is Mona Diab from George Washington University. We thank AI Lab for co-sponsoring a couple of these talks and multiple companies that sponsor some of our work. This is Quicken Loans, the American Mathematical Society, WACR, General Dynamics, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Simine. Look forward to your talk.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. And I decided that this would be a great opportunity to try out my new talk that I want to share with you all. So this is my first time talking about this, and I'm really looking forward to sharing these ideas and hearing your thoughts on it. Hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions. And I'm hoping I'll be able to see any chats that come in during the talk, so feel free to post questions there. And if I'm able to, I'll try to answer the questions as they come in. So this is something I've really only shared with my collaborators. We've been thinking about this. These include Giulia Bottesini and Sarah Schiavone at UC Davis and Fiona Fidler here at University of Melbourne. And we've all been talking a lot about how to measure quality for our research projects. So we're doing a lot of meta-science projects where we're trying to evaluate the quality of different papers in the psychology literature. And I should mention that our work is funded by DARPA and by the John Templeton Foundation. And in that work, and also in my work as a journal editor, I've kind of been facing the same question of how do we measure the quality of a paper? And in thinking about this, I've, sorry, one second, let me open the chat so that I can see what comes in. I've identified what I think are some pretty big problems with the way we currently conceptualize quality. And one of the problems is just that in the context of peer review, we aren't very explicit about this. This is something that we just assume peer review is going to measure quality, and we often just leave it at that. So just to jump to the punchline, here's what I'm going to argue in the talk today. I'm going to argue that a lot of the value created by peer review is wasted. There's a ton of value created, but we don't make the most of it. And as a result, readers of the empirical literature have very few clues to the quality of individual papers. And instead, we end up relying on indicators like journal prestige, and that creates perverse incentives for researchers and a lot of problems for science. And kind of in parallel to these issues, the emergence and popularity of preprints is really pressing the issue of how do we evaluate quality without relying on a heuristic like journal prestige. So when we need to know the quality of an individual paper, how do we tell that? And I'm going to argue that the solution is something I'm calling a quality factor or quality factors. I'm going to slip into using it in the singular, but really this is the idea of a bunch of different quantitative metrics that are reported transparently, shared publicly, that evaluate many different dimensions of quality and can be updated over time. So as we learn more, as our scientific understanding updates, we might revise our evaluation of the quality of past work. And this will help us earn public trust and credibility because people will see that we communicate and evaluate the quality of individual papers, not just based on journal prestige. And it'll realign the incentives for researchers because the goal now will be to get as high of a rating on quality as possible, or at least the dimensions that a particular researcher cares about, and not just to get into the most prestigious journal. So let me unpack this a little bit. So today I'll be addressing these questions. Why do we need something like a quality factor or quality factors? How do we go about creating it? What should it measure? I'll talk a little bit about some ongoing projects, but I'll warn you right now, we don't have a lot of data yet. And then I'll talk about some of the practicalities like getting uptake and preventing abuse of such a factor. And I'm going to be drawing mainly on my own home field of psychology, but I'm hoping that a lot of what I talk about, the principles apply across fields. And one of my points is going to be that we actually need to develop these within each field, borrowing, and learning from each other, but we need field-specific metrics of quality probably. So some of the details of what I talk about in terms of what I'm thinking about as measures, dimensions of quality in psychology may or may not apply to other fields, but hopefully the principles apply. Okay, so why do we need a quality factor? So one of the biggest questions, I think, for science in general, for explaining why science is trustworthy, why the public should trust science, for educating future scientists, et cetera, is answering the question, how do we know which findings we should trust? And there are different kind of answers to this question. So sometimes we appeal to the pyramid of evidence with systematic reviews at the top. But as we've learned from the replication crisis in psychology, if the base of that pyramid has problems, then the top of it is going to have problems as well. So meta-analyses didn't save us from replicability and reproducibility problems in psychology, for example, and they wouldn't save us from other kinds of problems either. Well, we could look at what makes it to textbooks, but again, I think psychology, and I'm picking on psychology, I don't think it's unique here, but one of the things we found in our crisis is that many of the findings that were textbook findings that literally appeared in textbooks, that were accruing many, many citations, that entire research programs were being built on, turned out not to be reliable. So this doesn't seem to be a particularly good heuristic for deciding which findings are solid either. Then there's things like prizes. So maybe that helps identify a few really solid, reliable findings, but doesn't work for the majority of the rest that we can't distinguish among with these prizes. And then there's the clue that most of us use most of the time, and that certainly our institutions use, which is journal prestige. So this is the idea that we're not going to bother to evaluate the quality of each individual paper. We're just going to outsource that to journal editors and reviewers. And if they pick a paper for a really selective, prestigious journal, where the papers there tend to get cited a lot, then we're going to assume that any individual paper in that journal has the same level of quality. Obviously, this is problematic, right? It creates a race to just do what it takes to get into the prestigious journals. The prestigious journals don't always have the same incentives as what's best for science. There's economic factors that drive their decisions. There's trying to improve their impact factor, et cetera. And so this has led to a movement to try to encourage not just individual researchers, but also institutions to move away from journal level metrics and specifically the impact factor, but more generally to evaluate research on its own merits. So there's several kind of shapes that this movement has taken, including the Leiden Manifesto. There's a more recent Hong Kong principles. And the one I'm most familiar with is DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment, which has been signed by a number of institutions in the US. I put a few up here. You can find more at this website. It's also recently been signed by my own university, University of Melbourne, and a few funders in the Academy of Science here in Australia. So one of the principles of DORA, I think, are captured pretty well in this tweet from DORA. And the one I'm going to focus on today is this idea that we need to evaluate research on its own merits. So not rely on heuristics like journal prestige. So that sounds nice, and I agree with this in principle, but what does it mean in practice? How do we evaluate research on its own merits? Maybe the most obvious answer is read the full manuscript, but this is not actually feasible in many situations. Now, of course it is in plenty of situations, right? If we're just evaluating one person, one candidate, we have time, we should read their work, absolutely. But it's not feasible at scale. So when we're evaluating many people, we can't read all of their papers. It's not feasible when we're rushed. So if we need to make a quick decision and there are a lot of papers to evaluate, it's not feasible for non-experts. So people who make decisions about public policy, for example, or journalists, or even scientists in neighboring fields often are not in a position to themselves evaluate the full paper themselves. Moreover, even if I am in a position and I have the time and expertise, if I read the full manuscript and come up with my own evaluation, that's just one person's evaluation. And I'm going to argue that we can do better. We can collect and share more information than that about the quality of a paper. So the next question that comes up when we talk about evaluating research on its own merits might be, well, isn't that what journals do? Isn't that the rationale behind outsourcing quality judgments to journals, is that this is what peer review in the journal system does? So as much as I love the peer review system in journals and I'm very involved with it, I spend many of my days reviewing and editing manuscripts for journals, I'm quite cynical about how effective it actually is at selecting papers based on quality. And if we think about it, think of it as social scientists would think about any other measure. If we thought about journal peer review as a measure of quality, it would be a really terrible measure. So first, there's no definition of quality. Most journals do not convey to reviewers or to editors a concrete operational definition of what they mean by quality, what the paper should be selected on. There's often some buzzwords, but it doesn't go much beyond that. Second, the ratings of quality provided by reviewers and by editors to authors are not quantitative. It's usually these impressionistic, open-ended descriptions of ratings, which are very rich and have a lot of information, but it's not easy to distill that information and quantify it. And then that rich information is reduced to just a binary decision. So a lot of information is lost in the gradations of quality problems and in the multidimensionality of quality. It's all reduced to just one accept or reject. Then these evaluations that this decision is based on are kept hidden. So all of that knowledge generated by the reviewers, all that information, the critiques generated by the reviewers and the editor are not shared with anybody. So that's basically information that's lost. And no one really scrutinizes or criticizes the process, partly because it's not transparent, that information is kept hidden. So there's no accountability. There's no way for users, consumers who want to know, well, do I trust their process? I can't look at it, so I can't tell. And their journals themselves don't put resources into validating their process. So this all led me to write a somewhat cynical column for Wired recently, where I said that peer-reviewed scientific journals don't really do their job. And I should also mention, I got a lot of these ideas were helped along by this paper by Hayson and Bright that I highly recommend, where these are philosophers who lay out very carefully some of the arguments for and against peer review as it currently works in journals. So if we took a step back and asked, well, what should peer review do? What's a reasonable expectation? Maybe we take the position of a member of the public who has heard of this idea of like peer review as the quality filter for science. Well, first, it should assess multiple dimensions of quality and articulate what those dimensions are, ideally producing quantitative ratings as well as open-ended, more impressionistic judgments. And then the journals should transparently report those evaluations, maybe without sharing the identity of the reviewers, but at least the content, or at a minimum, the numerical kind of rating of the quality of the paper on different dimensions. And there's no reason this should be either a binary outcome nor a static one. So this should be on continuous dimensions and updatable over time as our scientific understanding changes. So I'm going to call this a quality factor. So peer review should be producing an updating quality factor for each paper. But again, I want to emphasize it's not just one number, it's numbers on a bunch of different dimensions. And this quality factor should indeed be flexible so that different users can weigh different dimensions depending on what they care about. So somebody who really just wants the most reliable information is going to weigh the reliability dimensions a lot, maybe replicability, reproducibility, transparency, etc. Someone who cares more about innovation and discovery might weigh other dimensions more. The scores can be updated, as I mentioned, and this would change the incentives on authors from getting it accepted into the most prestigious journal, which can produce bad science, as McElrath and Smaldino and McElrath have shown. I encourage you to look up their great paper on the natural selection of bad science. If authors were instead motivated to improve the quality of their papers because they want to be rated as positively as possible and as many of these dimensions as possible, that would change the incentives on scientists right now. Incidentally, this would also take power away from unaccountable, non-transparent journals and allow scientists to reclaim the knowledge generated by our reviews I won't go into that too much. So as I was working on this talk, I remembered that I started thinking about these issues quite a while ago. So as you know, I'm in the field of psychology. Our field was hit by the replication crisis that started roughly in late 2011. And in 2012, I was starting to talk to people more about some of these problems. And a colleague of mine, Chris Fraley, had written a blog post where he advocated for, I think, or maybe it was a comment on his blog post. Yeah, it was Brent Donnellan's comment on his blog post, mentioned the idea that maybe we should have a consumer reports for journals. And so I emailed Chris Fraley and I said, hi, Chris, I just read your comment. Oh, it was Chris's comment on Brent Donnellan's blog post about how we need a consumer reports for journals. And I think this is the best actionable idea I've heard coming out of this replicability discussion that already felt like an endless discussion in August of 2012. So yes, this was August 1st, 2012. And then I said, it wouldn't be hard to do, right? So this was the beginning of the idea. In this version, it was at the journal level, back when I still thought in terms of journal level metrics, but the same idea could be applied to the article level, right? And then we could use those article level scores if we wanted to evaluate journals and rate them on the typical quality of the papers they publish. Okay, so here I am almost 9 years later, still working on this. So who would use information provided by something like a quality factor? Well, first, interested members of the public. So this would be something that would be understandable to members of the public. They would understand that some dimensions are more about rigor, some dimensions are more about maybe novelty or theoretical value, et cetera. And they could decide how much to trust papers based on the expert evaluations provided by these ratings. Of course, journalists would also find this information useful in deciding how to cover different discoveries and research findings and so on, as well as policymakers for obvious reasons. This would be very useful for them to have. Right now, these groups rely mainly on either what makes it to the news or past, through across their desk for whatever reason, or maybe if they're savvy, they rely on journal impact factor if they've heard of that, or maybe just on a few journals that they've decided are trustworthy. Of course, this would also be useful within the scientific community. For example, committees that have to review many applicants, so for jobs, for grants, for awards, et cetera, when we don't have time to review every paper of every candidate. It would be useful for scientists in neighboring disciplines, again, when they may not be in a position to have the skills or knowledge necessary to evaluate papers in a particular discipline. But I would argue this is often the case even within a discipline. I've read plenty of papers in psychology that I didn't have the expertise necessary to evaluate, and I would have loved to know what people closer to that area of expertise think of the paper. And so this is something that I would use even within my own field. It would be incredibly useful to know what experts think about how strong the paper is on different dimensions. So to sum up this part of my talk, I think that peer review is indeed broken, but peer reviews themselves are gold, and we're not treating them as the valuable information that they are. The amount of effort that experts put into peer review is tremendous and should not be wasted. So there's a lot of valuable information in reviewers' heads, and right now most of that is wasted or sometimes exploited by publishers. And we need to save that information. We need to share it as much as we can while protecting reviewers. We need to quantify it so that we can aggregate it, we can communicate it more easily to people outside of our community. And we should be concerned about the validity of the process. We should evaluate and validate the process of evaluation just like any other measure. Okay, so why do we need something like a quality factor? Because so far journals can't or won't tell us how good each paper is. I think they could, but they haven't taken that on as their job. So next I'll talk about, okay, how do we create something like a quality factor or quality factors? So there's this idea that you can't put a number on quality, right? Any quality measure will be an oversimplification, and that's definitely true. It'll leave out some qualities that can't be measured. It'll leave out some qualities that can be measured, but we didn't think of. And it'll have unintended consequences. It would reshape the incentive structure, hopefully overall in good ways, but there would be some unintended or unforeseen consequences. But on the other hand, we can only reward or incentivize what we measure. And right now, what we're measuring are things like impact. And if we want to reward quality, there's no way around trying to measure quality. So if we don't try to measure and reward quality, we'll only measure and reward other things. So I think that one way around this kind of queasiness that we have around putting a number on quality is to not put a single number on quality, to measure many different qualities, offer many indices, offer flexibility in how those different indices are going to be combined into various metrics so that there's not just one quality metric. Okay, so in terms of this challenge, I do think it's a really huge challenge to try to put numbers on quality. I'm not sure we can do it, but I don't think we can afford not to do it. And I think this anyway, when we consider the landscape of the traditional system, the status quo, but even if you don't agree with me about the problems with journal peer review and problems with the status quo, we don't have a choice because preprints are pressing the issue. So COVID research especially has really seen an explosion in the use of preprints, not just by researchers, but by journalists and even sometimes the public. And so we can't rely on journal prestige when evaluating preprints. We need a different metric for evaluating and communicating the quality of research that's only available via preprints. So this is a social science problem, right? We want to evaluate an abstract construct, paper quality, that's hard to measure. Any judgment is going to be imperfect, and bias is a major threat. Good thing we have social scientists, right? So how do we do this? We use the tools of social science to try to do this as well as possible while acknowledging that it's going to be impossible to get it completely right. So in my past work, I studied the personality and specifically self-knowledge, how much self-knowledge people have of their personalities. And so I had this same issue of trying to measure this really abstract thing. There are no perfect measures, there's a lot of bias, et cetera. And in both cases, I think it's really tempting to believe that there's an objective measure, a direct pipeline to the construct you want to measure, in this case, the quality of a paper, and that by going more objective, we're going to have a better measure. But I want to talk for a moment, go on a tangent and talk about some lessons on objective measures from behavioral or social science, and specifically from my area of personality assessment. So in addition to studying human personality, I also did a little bit of research on animal personality. And here there is this long tradition, which is also true a bit in the human personality world, of assuming that behavioral measures, coding actual objective behavior, is the gold standard. And that relying on any questionnaire ratings, say by humans who know the individual animals really well, maybe caretakers or researchers who work with individuals on a daily basis, that's much sloppier. That's not what we want to do. We want objective personality. We want to know how often this chimpanzee fights with another chimpanzee or runs away or is fearful, et cetera, using actual behavior. But what we found in our research, and others have found, but it's a very hard lesson to get across, is that actually the quote unquote objective measures are much worse than the ratings by experts who know the individuals really well. And that's for a number of reasons. First, objective measures are often really far from the constructs we're interested in. So maybe we're interested in gregariousness, but all we can measure is grooming behavior, right? Grooming behavior might be related to gregariousness, but it's not the only thing. That would be like measuring humans' extroversion just by looking at how many words are spoken, right? Extroversion does not just boil down to number of words spoken. So often when we go to an objective measure, we have to sacrifice a lot of the content of the construct we're interested in. Also, objective measures are not always easier to collect. In fact, they're often very laborious and time intensive. But most importantly, objective measures are not always objective. So when you start actually trying to code something like an interruption in a conversation, or even a chimpanzee running away from another chimpanzee, you realize there are tons of cases that are in the gray area. And if you don't allow these more subjective judgments to influence the rating, then you actually lose a lot of valuable information. And I think the same is true, to come back to to paper quality, the same is true with paper quality. If we forced reviewers or raters to only code the objective information and not use their judgment, we would lose a lot of information. So I think that really we don't want to get away from expert judgment. That is not the solution. The solution is not to run to something that feels more objective. I think we should embrace the richness of expert judgment. But as with all hard to measure constructs, we need to triangulate. So those judgments should be validated. And the best approaches to validating are to take a multi-pronged approach, like looking at agreement among the judges. That would be one clue towards reliability, which is necessary for validity. Whether the judgments predict outcomes, like the traditional measures of quality, like impact and so on. And indeed, correlations with objective characteristics. So is it the case that papers with larger samples get rated as higher quality on average, and so on? So we can't get away from objective characteristics, we need them, but we shouldn't put them on a pedestal and treat them as the direct pipeline to quality. So again, this is a social science problem, one that we're familiar with. So how do we do this? There's no direct pipeline, we'll have to do it the hard way. So first we need to really clearly define our construct, develop imperfect measures and triangulate across those measures. And I think I would add, not be afraid of subjective ratings by experts and not put objective measures on a pedestal. So I'm going to briefly describe 3 different approaches we could take to evaluating quality, going from most quote unquote objective to most subjective. So the first would be to just code a bunch of objective characteristics of papers, like sample size, was there blinding, et cetera, et cetera. And there are quite a few checklists out there like this, mostly focused on transparency or disclosure, but occasionally, like the critical appraisal tools in biomedicine, for example, often have more questions about objective characteristics of papers, like was there blinding, et cetera. This has the advantage that it feels objective. So ironically, reviewers like these kinds of measures. And for some variables, it can be done at scale, but as I mentioned, there are some disadvantages. The next would be to enumerate specific qualities and then have raters rate those. So these would be more subjective judgments, but still on relatively narrow, concrete dimensions, like maybe how good was the sample size? So not the number of the sample size, but was it an appropriate good sample size for the question at hand, et cetera. This has a lot of advantages. The dimensions can be weighted in various ways to create a lot of different metrics. This can be modular. I'm going to go into a lot more detail on this approach. This is the one that I think is the most promising, but as I mentioned, we need to use all of the approaches. The main disadvantage is that it might not capture quality just by, summing the different dimensions. So another important perspective would be just to ask experts, how good is this paper? To get a global, holistic measure of quality from experts. This is the closest thing to the construct we're interested in, but perhaps we lose a lot of information, and we often want to know, was this a good paper because it really pushed the boundaries, but we're unsure about the results, or was it a different kind of good paper, one that's really solid and incremental, but didn't really break new ground? So we lose a lot of information with just this measure. So I'm going to argue that really 2 and 3 can be combined. If you're getting experts to rate specific qualities, you should also ask them about their overall impression. So these could really be combined, and we could contrast approach 1, which is the more objective coding, with 2 and 3, which are more subjective ratings. Okay, so I'm going to speed up a bit because I'm looking at the time. So I'm going to talk about now, go really specific into psychology about what are some dimensions of quality that I think that we should look at in psychology. So the question here is, where do we start? How do we decide what qualities matter for making a paper good? We could look at things that we teach our undergraduates are important for good research. We could look at our stated scientific values. We could think about what society expects from us, what the public thinks makes a high quality research. All of these are good sources for brainstorming. I also looked at things like critical appraisal tools, rubrics, and checklists that are already out there. And I've distilled these into a few different qualities in psychology. And I don't claim that these are exhaustive. These are just some of the ones that seem to come up a lot in thinking about the quality of a contribution paper in psychology. And I'm going to try to organize these, which I'm calling quality factors, into different kind of clusters. So in my mind, these go together with a few different clusters. So one is about transparency, one is about validity, one is about substantial contribution, and then there's a few that hang by themselves: intellectual humility and ethical soundness. I'm going to skip this. So now I've just reorganized the same qualities vertically. And what I'm going to show you next is a questionnaire measure that I'm working on developing right now, so has not been validated yet. I have a grant proposal out to try to pay a lot of reviewers to use this rubric or something like it to evaluate a bunch of psychology papers. So these would be rated on Likert type scales. So asking a few questions about each of these different qualities, just to give you a sense of more concretely what I mean by validity, for example. So here I'm using the 4 validities framework by Shadish, Cook, and Campbell. So I'm asking about things, construct validity with item 5, internal validity with item 6, et cetera. But the specifics don't matter too much. And if you're in a different field that doesn't kind of conceptualize validity this way, this might not make any sense to you, and that's fine. So again, this isn't just the only way to operationalize these constructs, but if we were going to take a top-down kind of expert ratings of the dimensions we think are important, these are the kinds of questions I would want to ask experts to rate about psychology papers. Okay, so now I'll tell you about a few ongoing projects. And again, I don't want you to get too excited. We don't have data for most of these. We haven't looked at the data yet for most of these. Okay, so first I'll tell you about a project that's using this more objective coding approach. And this is led by Sarah Schiavone, who's a graduate student in my lab at UC Davis. I moved from UC Davis fairly recently. Not all of us were able to move. So we are coding objective characteristics of papers specifically in the social and personality psychology literature. So this is our subfield of psychology. And we were interested in this subfield partly because it's ours and partly because it was arguably in the eye of the storm of the replication crisis that hit around 2011-12. And that this field experienced some changes to things like journal policies, et cetera, uptake in new practices like pre-registration, especially towards the second half of the last decade, so 2015 to 20 roughly, I would say. So we decided to code a bunch of papers in this literature between 2010 and 2020, in part to track these changes, to see what is changing. So our sample is articles published in these journals. Maybe these acronyms don't mean anything to you, don't worry about that. It's a combination of the more prestigious journals in social and personality psychology and some open access journals, because we see this as a service to the journals that we're coding. They may not see it that way, but we didn't want to exclude journals whose values are more closely aligned with ours. In full disclosure, I've been an editor at a few of these journals, and I'm currently editor at Collabora and on the board of PLOS. So I definitely have a vested interest in seeing how these things turn out. All the more reason for us to be very, very transparent. We'll make all our data public, et cetera, and encourage people to scrutinize our work. We've also added preprints posted to the psychology preprint server in this time window. It didn't exist in 2010, but any preprints posted since then will be included in our project. So this is thousands and thousands of articles. We call it the roller coaster project. Not clear why we call it that, but I couldn't think of a better name for this talk, so I went with the truth. And we have different tiers of coding. So we have some things that our undergraduate research assistants in our lab, who we've trained, are coding. And we had to make some difficult decisions and do a lot of pilot testing to figure out which variables could be coded by undergraduate research assistants who don't have a lot of expertise or experience reading this literature, and which variables needed to be coded by our team members who are social and personality psychologists who have published in these journals, read these journals a lot, and so on. So here's what we came up with. The undergraduate coders are currently coding things like the sample size, the type of participants, are they students, are they other adults, are they children, et cetera, whether the population is a hard to reach population, how bold are the claims made in the title and abstract. We tried to have undergraduates code are the claims in the abstract causal claims. We turned out that did not work with a lot of training. That was too hard to teach students who aren't familiar with these concepts. And we had some of them code the PhD year of the first author. And then things that my graduate students and I spend several hours a week. So we have coding hours on Zoom, and Sarah has developed a Shiny app that shows us the relevant parts of the paper, bolds certain words, and we fill out a coding form. Coding, was there a sample size justification? Was there a discussion of power? Was it an experimental or observational design within or between participants design? Which kinds of methods were used? So questionnaire methods, physiology, behavior, et cetera. How intensive on a Likert type scale were the methods? Were limitations mentioned? And a couple of other collaborators are p-curving, which if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it, but just one of the journals in our sample. And then we have some things that we are hoping to be able to automate. And I see a comment about machine learning. And this is something we're hoping that our data will help us figure out which things can be automated, which things do we not need to rely on the valuable time of experts to judge. So by getting kind of the ground truth coded the hard way by humans for these variables on the left, we're hoping that we can eventually, for some of them, develop an algorithm that gets pretty close to the human judgments. For other things, we're already quite confident that the algorithms work and we are validating them. So things like, is there open data available, a link to a data set, statistical reporting errors, whether the study was run online or in person, things like that, some of these we have coded ourselves and are trying to train an algorithm to capture the same level of quality of ratings that we're providing. Okay, so I'm actually going to skip our research questions. I can come back to them if people are interested in the Q&A. But the point is that using this kind of objective coding approach, I think we've been able to develop or operationalize measures of these qualities across the different dimensions of quality, not all of them, but many of them. So it's possible to operationalize them in concrete, objective ways. Again, I don't think this is the best way to operationalize them. And we'll see when we analyze our data, how good those measures are. So we'll look at inter-rater agreement. We're having everything is being coded by at least 2 raters. And we'll be able to see how well the different dimensions correlate with each other and so on. Okay, I'm gonna skip this. So there are other examples of coding objective characteristics out there in the literature besides our team's work. I'm sorry to give it short shrift, but I just want to spend a few minutes talking about this other set of approaches of looking at more subjective ratings of quality. And we have a couple of projects going on about this. So actually a subset of the papers in the roller coaster project, we're also having experts read the whole paper, evaluate it, rate it on Likert type scales like those items that I showed you earlier. So we'll be able to compare for those papers, we'll have both the objective codings and the experts ratings. We have one project that my lab played a small role in that did also look at overall global ratings of the qualities of papers. And this project was specifically looking at the quality of registered report papers, which is a new style of paper that is being offered in psychology and a few other fields, where the idea is to try to remove a lot of bias by having both the authors commit to a plan ahead of time and the journal commit to publishing the results regardless of how the paper turns out. So the paper goes out for peer review before the data are collected. So there's a chance to agree on the best methods, kind of finalize the methods, and then everybody commits to following that plan and publishing the results regardless of the outcome. So Courtney Soderberg and her collaborators wanted to look at whether the papers that are published as registered reports are higher quality than traditional papers. And they recruited a bunch of reviewers who rated a registered report and a control paper that was matched by either being the same authors or the same journal as the registered report. And they removed information that identified whether the paper was a registered report or not. So they were trying to get evaluations of quality without the rater knowing if it was a registered report. And I'm just going to skip to the results. So they had raters evaluate different dimensions of quality. And these are differences between how the registered reports were rated versus the traditional papers. And a positive score means the registered reports were rated more positively. So the raters stopped their reading and rated the methods and so on before they saw the results. And at that point, they rated the rigor much higher, quality of the methods higher for registered reports than others. For some other dimensions, there was not a big difference. After knowing the study outcomes, they rated the rigor of the analysis, the justification of the conclusions, the quality of results higher for registered reports. And overall, they rated that the quality of the paper was higher for registered reports, the discoveries were more important, et cetera. And even on some dimensions where you might imagine that this new format would lead to more boring research, because maybe if the papers aren't being selected based on the findings, maybe the findings are going to be less interesting and exciting. But we still see, for example, here on amount learned, innovative results, et cetera, there's certainly not a lower rating for the registered reports. If anything, it's a bit higher for registered reports. All right, I'm gonna skip a bit more. Okay, and then for that same project, the role of my team was to code some objective characteristics of the papers so that we could also compare the papers, not just on these global ratings, but on objective coded characteristics. So things like, were there open materials shared? So the first data column is the registered reports and the other 2 data columns are the comparison papers. So you can see that registered reports were more likely to have open materials, open data, and pre-registration. That's not too surprising. They also had a larger median sample size, although not mean, but means and sample sizes are weird because of outliers. But they weren't better on all metrics. So there were some ways in which they were arguably worse. So like whether they included a difficult to reach population, only 1 out of 29 registered reports had a sample that was from a difficult to reach population. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here in the interest of having lots of time for questions, but I want to emphasize that I think what we're doing in our various research projects is trying to operationalize these different qualities in different ways, both concrete objective codings and more subjective ratings from experts, and hopefully validate those methods against each other, identify when one approach is better, when we can save the time of experts and try to get a more direct automated measure, and when we really need to get expert ratings. For which dimensions is it really important that we get that critical thinking that comes with expertise and so on. Oh, I did have a couple of slides on getting uptake and preventing abuse, so maybe I will quickly go through those. So the getting uptake is going to be difficult. How do we get people to use this? But luckily, there are already some existing platforms, including, so preprint servers provide an opportunity to do this because you can comment on preprints, et cetera. And I especially like the website peerreview.org, which focuses on biology and interacts with the bioRxiv preprint server. But they do things like create a community that helps train people in being good reviewers. They do journal clubs, etc. I think that kind of model works really well. We could also think about making it modular so that an expert could go in and just judge one dimension of quality. So for example, the Twitter account just says in mice, all it does is point out when a headline is misleading because it implies that the research was done in humans, but actually it was done in mice. That's a valuable form of peer review, a very narrow form of quality evaluation, but it's there. And if there were more accounts like that, picking out different aspects of quality, that would be really useful. Some have advocated putting money into this. I think another idea that in some ways is less progressive, but maybe more radical, is to try to get journals to adopt something like a quality factor in peer review. Ask the journals to show us the data. Let us know what did the reviewers and editor think of this paper? What was good about it and what was bad about it? Tell us maybe in quantitative ratings, how the paper fared on different dimensions. Why was it accepted? Was it accepted because of how innovative it was or because of how rigorous it was, et cetera? And then another important issue is preventing abuse. And here again, I think the peerreview.org platform has a lot of great solutions. So things like requiring users to create an account, which links their ORCID. So the people running the platform know who everyone is accountable at some level, but they do allow pseudonyms. So people can post reviews without revealing their identity, which I think is a really nice balance. They have a code of conduct and they have moderators to provide some oversight. So I think their model is a really promising one. Okay, so this was where I started and it's where I'll end, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Simine. Everyone in chat, if you have any questions that you'd like to submit, you can put those in through either the Q&A side of things or into the actual chat feature, and Jag or myself and Simine will do our best to get those read out and answered.
So there was a comment from Pam Davis Keene, not quite a question, but Pam, if you're on, do you want to expand on your comment? Oh, she's not a panelist. She can't talk.
Okay. Yeah, so her comment is, it sounds like a great use of semi-structured machine learning to try and get at the quality factor. And so actually, I mentioned that some of our funding comes from DARPA, and this is part of the aim of the DARPA project. It's called the SCORE project. And our team is collecting data from human judges evaluating the quality of papers, but the ultimate goal is to see whether those judgments of quality can be automated using machine learning. I don't know much about that side of things, and I'm not sure how much, I don't have anything to reveal anyway, and I'm not sure if I would be allowed to if I did, but that's kind of the general gist of that. So I think that's a very promising direction, yeah.
So here's a question on from Jing Liu in your Q&A screen.
Yeah.
But people can game whatever set of measures we have. So I'll let you go ahead and
yeah, I think that's a really big problem. I'm not sure how to think about those problems that apply both to the status quo and to any changes we want to make. So to me, that's not a reason not to try to make changes, but it's a reason to be very careful and deliberate about how we implement any new system. And that point, I think it really highlights how not deliberate we were in designing the old system, right? A lot of the ways that peer review work that way because of the technology that was available at the time, or because that's how it was always done. And so I think we really need to think about, like right now in journal peer review, it's so not transparent that if there was corruption going on, we wouldn't know. And we now have had some whistleblowers and know of cases of of corrupt editors and so on, but it's so easy for editors and reviewers to behave badly and nobody know about it. So I think that transparency is going to help a bit with that. It's not going to solve the problem, but at least it'll bring light to the issue and help us figure out where the problems are. But I do think this is obviously something we need to think really hard about as we design new systems, but also when we evaluate the old system. Should I keep reading from the
just keep going, please.
So another question was from Ed Schneider that was, what in your wildest dreams do you think this approach can scale to? So in my wildest dreams, and actually maybe I'll read Pam Davis-Keene's question together with that one. So she asked, do we need journals if we can review preprints and have quality information available? So in my wildest dreams, we wouldn't need journals anymore. So people would realize that what they really want to know about a paper is it trustworthy and credible? Can I rely on these conclusions? And that journals aren't telling them that information. But if we started having quantitative scores on preprints that were, from experts, that were multidimensional, that were aggregatable and updating over time, I think people would realize the value of that and rely less and less on journal prestige. If journals don't have prestige, then people aren't going to be willing to jump through all the hoops that it takes to get into a journal, to pay the APCs that it takes to publish in open access journals, or to pay the subscriptions for the paywalled journals. So in my wildest dreams, I think it would scale quite widely, and that eventually we wouldn't need journals anymore, and everything would happen overlaid on preprint servers, ideally with structure and oversight like the prereview.org website provides, not a free-for-all. But I think it could scale across science, really. I don't know enough about differences across different sciences, so I'm nervous even generalizing to social sciences, much less beyond that. But in principle, I think the problems are similar across the sciences, and so hopefully the solutions can have a lot in common. The next question was from Jing Liu. What if publishing the anonymous reviewers' evaluations of the papers is a way to lay out some of the nuances of the paper and make reviewers more accountable? Definitely. I'm less worried about reviewers being unaccountable than I am about editors being unaccountable, but both are important. But what I see in my job, so one of the things we do at Collabora is we accept submissions of papers that were rejected in another journal, and the authors can submit the decision letter and reviews from the other journal, and we consider that for publication in our journal. We call it streamlined review. And so I see some of the stuff the editors at other journals say, and of course we've all seen this, or we've had friends forward us outrageous reviews or decision letters, and the lack of accountability, I think, is a really big problem. And so one of the things I've been lobbying for is to get journals and publishers and societies to, at a minimum, tell authors that they have the right to post, share, publish the decision letters on their own papers. Maybe not the reviews, because there's copyright issues and ownership issues over the reviews, but the decision letters. The editors work for the journals, they work for the scientific community. At a minimum, authors should be able to share those, because we see plenty of discussions on social media of someone saying, it's outrageous, I got rejected for this crazy reason, but they can't show us the letter and we can't see it. And some of those stories are probably not true. Some of them probably are. We can't tell the difference, and we can't hold journals accountable. So I do think that surfacing all of those, at least decision letters, but ideally also reviews, would, I think, curb some of the bad behavior on the part of editors and reviewers and make the whole process more accountable. I think that would be a very nice side effect of this. Then Ernie King asked, to what extent do you think the quality factor process can also be extended to identify fake news? It seems your approach is well thought through and extensible and generalizable, and thus may be useful in this area as well. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, I think that would be really great. I know of a group that recently started a project trying to do this about COVID news. I can't remember the names of the people in the group, but I think it's a group out of the UK that created a website recently. They're scientists, and they basically try to evaluate the validity of news around COVID research. And so I think that's a great use of researchers' expertise. The question is, can we reward the researchers who choose to spend their time this way? I hope there would be a place for researchers using their expertise in this way, as it's obviously very valuable to the public. Then Jennifer Lynn Piedmont asked, do you see the strategy of lobbying journals to adopt new practices and the difficulties associated with that connected to the financial structure that researchers and universities are in with journals? Yeah, I think a lot of it is about the financial structure. So having been an editor of a more traditional paywalled journal, I noticed, and I don't think this was specific to the journal that I was editing at, but there was a lot of fear of hurting the impact factor and hurting the submission rate, and also just generally the reputation of the journal. So any changes that might rock the boat, that might upset the more famous people who publish in the journal or review for the journal, that might lead to decline in submissions or decline in impact factor, they were very afraid to do. And it was interesting because some of these changes might actually have a positive impact on those metrics as well. Probably not the money bottom line, but at least reputation or maybe even impact. It's not clear that they would hurt things. But even then, people are very risk averse, especially because for societies, for example, so much of their income comes from paywall journals. So it's a huge risk to put that source of income on the line. For universities, I'm not sure that their incentives are again lined up against these changes because they pay a lot of money for subscriptions. So it's not really in their interest to help the journals and publishers and societies that are charging them exorbitant amounts for subscriptions. They might welcome a system that kind of reduces the power and the monopoly of those organizations. I'm not sure. It's interesting to see who has signed DORA and who hasn't. I'm not sure that it really lines up with whether those universities support a move towards open access publishing or preprints, et cetera. But you would think that that would be one motivation for pushing universities and other groups to move away from things like journal impact factor would be the financial motivation. But I don't really know what universities, what incentives universities respond to. It's kind of a mystery to me. Sarah Catherine Lafia asks, how does your team find references to data in a paper, and what does data availability say about quality? This is a really good question. So because we're dealing with a really narrow field, subfield, social and personality psychology, it's quite easy to find references to data because we look for a link. So when I said, the characteristics that I put in the column of algorithm, I should have said is algorithm plus a human checking them. So we have things that the algorithm looks for. If a paper gets flagged, then we have one of us check that it really is a case of that. So if the algorithm finds a link that looks like it might be a link to data, which most psychology papers in our subfield, if they're going to have a link, it's usually to open data, open materials, or pre-registration. So then we have a human check it to make sure that it really is. We don't actually open the data set and reanalyze it. That would take a long time. There are other groups that do research looking at that. That's great. But we just check that there is something at that link. What does data availability say about quality is a really, really good question. I don't think it says much. I think of transparency, including data availability when it's ethically and legally possible, as a precursor to quality, that we can't really get a good sense of quality if we don't have access to that information. It's like asking someone to buy a car without lifting the hood. Like, no, don't look over there, just tell me if it's good. So for most papers, especially when there are no legal or ethical barriers to sharing data, sharing materials, et cetera, that's just basic information that you should be willing to provide so that someone can scrutinize your work. And if they can't access it, then it's going to be hard for them to make a judgment about quality. If they can access it, that doesn't mean that it's high quality, right? By being transparent, we shouldn't get points for quality, but we get points for transparency, and then the quality judgment will be more accurate, whatever it is. So transparency makes it possible to get the credibility we deserve, and doesn't mean that it's high quality. So it's a common confusion, and it is complicated, right? We should treat a paper that has open data as more credible than a paper that doesn't, all else equal, like the legal and ethical barriers to that. But actually, when we go in and look at the data for the paper that has data available, we might end up thinking it's worse. So all else might not be equal, and that's a tricky situation. Another question from Pam Davis-Keene. Psychology and medicine have similar issues of fast publication, small samples, highly incentivized to publish quality, or not, to publish quality or not. What are the obstacles getting people to adopt the quality factors? Yeah, so it's interesting, the similarities and differences with medicine. So in medicine, my understanding is that things like critical appraisal tools are more widespread, partly because systematic reviews are much more common. And so I think these evaluations of quality are done in the service of systematic reviews. So they're not necessarily shared publicly, except in like a table in a review paper. Because psychology doesn't have as much of a tradition of meta-analysis and systematic review and so on, I think we haven't developed as many tools and rubrics for evaluating quality, but neither field has develop this habit of sharing that information publicly, of making that a metric on which we evaluate papers beyond in systematic reviews. So it's interesting in the case of medicine, they're putting all this effort into evaluating the quality of individual papers, but that's just going into the systematic review. And it's not, from my understanding, being shared more broadly or being linked to the reputation of the authors, et cetera. There's still a pretty heavy reliance on journal prestige and all of that. So I think the mentality is very similar, that like, well, what are we going to do? We have to go with journal prestige because we don't have any other information, even though in medicine, they do have a culture of evaluating individual papers in the context of systematic reviews. So part of it is getting people to just stop and ask themselves, like, can we do better than relying on journal prestige, for example? And there are already solutions out there, especially in medicine. So getting people to realize that the solution is there, it's really close at hand. We just need to implement it a bit more broadly and outside of just this one context of systematic reviews. And then a question from Ed Schneider. Do you see an article having a single set of QF scores, or would there be a range for each QF for an article? Yeah, so what I'm imagining is that there would be ratings from multiple different experts on multiple different dimensions, and maybe some experts would only rate some dimensions. So it could be that like 8 people rated transparency, here are the 8 ratings, and then 12 people rated replicability and so on. And then that raw data would be publicly available. And so different people or groups could create metrics out of those. So there could be a metric called like big if true that really weights innovation and theory and contribution, how much of a substantial contribution it's making, and doesn't weight other things like rigor or sample size, et cetera, as much. And then there could be a metric that's like accurate, but maybe boring, and that would weigh the opposite things. And in my ideal world, there would be many different metrics created by different groups who value different things. And then users could choose which of the metrics they're going to use, or maybe it depends on the purpose, right? One day I need something that's really reliable, so I look at that at one metric. Another day I want to read something that's going to blow my mind, so I look at a different metric.
So I'd like to give you a little bit of history in terms of something vaguely similar that I had tried to do and failed about 20 years ago. We started this notion of what we were calling restaurant reviews for technical work. And the idea was to use archive. So it's unrefereed publication and post-publication refereeing. And the point was to make the refereeing open. So it's all reviews are signed and public. And so you trust the reviewers that you like, and you read the papers that reviewers that you like recommend to you. And so we got a whole bunch of people to write reviews, and there was this natural thing of nobody wants to criticize anybody in public. And so it was a single-sided reviewing. Right. So if a paper was noticed, people would say, hey, I read that paper. I loved it. I'm going to write a paragraph about it.
Yeah.
The author is happy. I'm happy. I really like the paper. But having any new system sort of take off requires that one gets to a certain critical mass and big adoption. And so we got, we got some movement, but not enough that it built up the critical mass before that initial oomph died, and it never got to where I was hoping it would. You've got a much more ambitious plan, and you've got a lot more interesting things going on. And success in these things is just when it just happens and you get past the tipping point, and then the world is different. And it's been really, really great that you're sharing this vision with us. It's really exciting. And I wish you all success, and I hope that it happens.
Thank you. I mean, I'm hoping that all the turmoil in psychology from the replication crisis provides fertile ground for change, that people are more ready for change because of this crisis, but it is very idealistic. I recognize that. And one of the reasons I'm applying for grants is that I think initially the best way to get people to do these reviews is going to be to pay them. And I think that's a good ethical thing to do anyway, but it's hard to find the money. But if we could seed it with, people who are paid to contribute to the system, and we maybe also use that to get evidence to validate it, then maybe it has a better chance of taking off. But I know it's kind of a moonshot, but I think that the time might be ripe for it, and psychology might be a good field to try this in, but we'll see.
Thank you very much for
Thank
spending
you.
time
Thanks
with
for
us,
having
and
me.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye, and thanks everybody for attending.